If a small minority of writers succumbed to British social Darwinist ideas of progress, then they were not merely coming up to the benchmark set and propagated successfully by British imperialism. However, the continuation of the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire did not require a genocidal policy on the part of the Ottomans, but the establishment of a nationalist Armenian state in Anatolia did. This was because, unlike the Greeks and Bulgarians in the old Balkan provinces, who possessed majorities and many of the elements of nationhood, in none of the eastern provinces did the Armenians constitute a majority of the population. So whilst it was comparatively easy for Greeks, Bulgarians, once Western ideas of nationalism had reached them, to enlarge the autonomy of their own community into territorial independence, any attempt to transfer Armenian autonomy from a religious to a territorial basis was quite another matter. The population of the modern eastern provinces was such that a restoration of the old Armenian kingdom was impossible without overcoming 6 centuries of history through the construction of a homogeneous Armenian state. That would have, of necessity, have involved ethnic cleansing of large numbers of Turks and Kurds, and almost certainly have required a policy of genocide against them to achieve a stable Armenia. In the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, the area claimed for an Armenian state was gigantic and included territory as far west as Sivas and Adana. The Ottoman state was an established functional entity built upon peace and stability of 6 centuries, whereas an Armenian state in the region would have been a violent revolutionary affair. These types of constructions are rarely good for any minorities that might find them obstructing the necessary process of nation buildings. Turks, Kurds, Jews, other Armenian groups in the new state would have more than likely been exterminated or driven out. The question of intention is also relevant. There are instances in which population movements involving slaughter were planned and done intentionally. For instance, the area bombing of Germany during World War II by the RAF had the intention of killing the German workforce. It was planned, refined, with the intention of maximizing working class casualties within dense population areas. There were also huge population movements conducted by the British in Malaya and Kenya during uprisings, about which as little has been known since till lately. It is not at all a convincing argument to suggest that the Ottomans had any intention or plan to wipe out the Armenians. There was a complete absence of such an ideal in Ottoman literature, and the appliance of basic historical principle of cause and effect suggests that the relocations were a practical response to an emergency situation, however badly they might have been handled. In the spring of 1915, 3 events precipitated and provoked the Armenian relocations: the Gallipoli landings by the British, a large ambush in Zayton by Armenian insurgents, and the Armenian rebellion in Van, which resulted in a massacre of Muslims. In April, Lord Bryce and the Friends of Armenia in London made a widely publicised appeal for funds to equip Armenian volunteers fighting behind Turkish lines. Any state will protect itself if attacked, and these 3 events, which took place right across Ottoman Turkey, with the Russians on the advance into Anatolia, placed the state on an emergency footing of the highest order. Population movement was the primary defensive measure taken by the Ottoman state in relation to these events and the position of the Armenians, and most of the deaths occurred incidentally to this emergency measure. The Russian reform program of 1913-14 had left little doubt in Istanbul that Russia aimed to annex Turkey's 6 eastern provinces, over which she had declared a propriety interest. And that was the usual preliminary to an imperial power declaring a formal protectorate and annexing a region. Before the declarations of war on the Ottoman Empire, the Russians had begun arming the Armenians in preparation for invasion. The Russian armies brought with them Armenian groups armed with allied weapons whose main purpose was to kill Turks and Kurds, which they proceeded to do. British and Russian agents circulated amongst the Armenians behind the Turkish lines and provided them with weapons and money to enable them to create general disorder. In the Armenian capture of Van and the general massacre of Muslims that had followed, Ottoman soldiers were diverted and prevented from reaching the front to fight the invaders. All these factors influenced the Ottomans to relocate the Armenian population. Along with the Armenian relocation, there was also a relocation of up to 800,000 Muslims from the war zone. When the Ottoman authorities moved various peoples out of the war zones, they became prey to other groups with scores to settle. Muslim civilians faced similar problems as they fled the attacking Russian armies, only to be harassed by armed Armenian bands. I've seen figures of up to 500,000 Muslims killed, with extensive lists of names and modes of death recorded by the authorities. Even before 1915, Eastern Anatolia resembled a powder keg. The Kurdish tribes were well armed, virtually sovereign in the areas they roamed. They and the Christian townsmen bought arms from the Russians, and frequent skirmishes occurred between different groups. The Russians flirted with using the Kurds, as well as the Armenians, as instigators of chaos in the region prior to the war. Order was only maintained by the Ottoman presence between the various elements. If that presence was removed, as it inevitably would in wartime, it was predictable as to what would occur. Relocations were the standard military response to guerrilla warfare waged behind the lines at the time. A decade and a half before the Turks relocated the Armenians, the British relocated Boer and African civilians away from the war zone in the Transvaal into concentration camps. This was not a defensive act conducted in response to encirclement, invasion and rebellion, as was the case in Anatolia in 1915, but it was done in the course of an aggressive expansion aimed at neutralizing a population that was resisting conquest. The United States also conducted relocations with regard to the Native Americans, putting them into reservations, and this was after multiple genocides were carried out over centuries on the American continent. Britain conducted its relocations and confinements in stable conditions, controlling the seas around Africa under no pressure of blockade, with plentiful availability of food supplies in a localized conflict fought in a gentlemanly way by their opponents. And yet they still managed to kill tens of thousands of Boer and African women and children in the process. It was called methods of barbarism at the time, but I've never seen it called genocide. The Armenians were not imprisoned by the Ottomans, but resettled away from the war zone. It was probable the majority survived the forced migration into Syria, and Armenians away from the war zone in Istanbul, Izmir and Edirne, were largely left alone. Therefore, the character of the Ottoman actions suggests that it was more of a defensive emergency war measure than an aggressive extirpating campaign practiced by imperial powers. The difference between what the British did in South Africa and what the Ottomans attempted to do in Eastern Anatolia was that the Ottomans were confronted by a much stronger enemy, an assault on their state. The Armenian relocations were conducted in a situation of external invasion, blockade, starvation, inter-community killing, and the general lawlessness of a collapsing state apparatus. Professor Zizek's book, The Great War and the Forced Migration of Armenians, shows the Ottomans did not have the intention of destroying the Armenian population in the course of moving them out. He shows that they were attempts to care for them in various ways. The decree of locations issued by the Ottoman government insisted that those who were moved should be cared for, protected, and adequately fed, and preparations were made to this effect. However, the war conditions imposed on the region by the Entente invasions and blockade ensured that such conditions could be adequately met. Okay, we're just coming to the end now. The British blockade of the Ottoman Empire, which began even before the formal declaration of war, was carried out with the intention of starving Ottoman citizens to force them into surrender and encouraging a general collapse of Ottoman society into anarchy. A similar blockade was organised against neutral Greece to encourage regime change and her enlistment in the Allied ranks. It has been argued that it was the neglect and incompetence of the Ottoman authorities that were responsible for such high levels of deaths amongst its own soldiers. However, it must be remembered that Germany suffered nearly 1 million deaths from the starvation blockade organised against it by the Royal Navy. Germany was a highly organised society with great skills of improvisation that helped it to hold out against blockade for 4 years. However, it too failed and was ground down by the irresistible force of the Royal Navy. This is the conclusion. The logical implication of all this is that if what happened to the Armenians in 1915 is to be described as genocide, we must look much wider for those responsible than just within the CUP and Ottoman authorities directly responsible for relocating the Armenians. If the deaths of Armenians are seen as genocide, the powers that were most responsible for it were Britain and Russia, and to a lesser extent France. In the interest of destroying Germany and conquering the Ottoman territories, they made the Ottoman state an impossible place for Armenians to live in the space of a few months, after they had lived in it peacefully for centuries. If we are to talk of an Armenian genocide and insist on an official apology, we must put these countries in the dock first, because without their actions, it would never have happened. Thank you.
Just before my presentation, I would like to make two very short remarks following the presentation of Mr. Walsh. First, when Mr. Robertson alleged that there is no debate about the labels regarding the fate of Ottoman Armenians among legal scholars, I would just like to say that last fall was published in the European Journal of International Law, a journal edited by Oxford University Press, a debate between the chairman of the Union Armenian Association in Sweden and myself, and with the delegation of Mr. Pulat. But maybe in the eyes of Mr. Robertson, a journal edited by Oxford University is not very serious. Secondly, when Mr. Robertson says that Raphael Lemkin is the main author of the United Nations Convention on Genocide, is nearly wrong. Because if Lemkin coined definitely the word genocide, his definition of genocide was rejected during the debate within the United Nations. So I humbly suggest to Mr. Robertson to study law before to make this kind of arrogant. So, thank you. Hundreds of attacks were perpetrated by Armenian terrorists during the 1970s and 1980s, and also some others during the 1990s. The majority of these attacks took place in democratic Western countries, and the Orly bombing in 1983 was merely the most murderous terrorist attack of French history in time of peace. The support coming from the Armenian diaspora, or more exactly, from the nationalist elements of this diaspora, is commonly denied or forwarded. The close links between the political campaigns against Turkey regarding the alleged Armenian genocide and the terrorist attacks are similarly denied or forwarded. The memories of the Armenian terrorism itself are largely erased. Very few plaques or monuments have been erected outside of Turkey, and for the Orly attack, there is merely nothing. no break, no money, no. Michael Gunther, who is one of the main specialists of Armenian theories, said that he found smiling skepticism when he spoke to educated Americans about the very existence of Armenian Jews. That's why I chosen this topic this night. The goal of this presentation is to explain how this theorism emerged, or it was justified by distortion of history. Of course, when Armenian died, I will stress at this point, so justified by distortion of history, especially by the use of fakes, and finally, all this misuse of the past is continuing until today. So the first part of this presentation is about Armenian terrorism, the rise of the political violence. First, the origin. The title of my presentation mentions the date 1972. Maybe some people ask why 1972, the first assassination took place in 1973, the campaign in 1975, why 1972? The first bomb threat by Armenian terrorists in this wave took place on October 21, 1972 in Los Angeles. Gorbel Yanekian, the first Armenian terrorist of this period, took his decision to kill 2 Turkish diplomats in April 1972. But even more importantly, the World Congress of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Dashnik Party, which took place in Vienna in December 1972, decided the creation of a terrorist branch named the Justice Commandos for the Armenian Genocide. Indeed, as early as 1971, a group had been created within the RAF of Lebanon, but Palestinian terrorists, namely the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, quickly took the control of this group, which became eventually, in 1975, the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia, or their main Armenian terrorists. So, the new wave of Armenian terrorism in the end of 20th century is not the so-called desperate response to the refusal of United Nations to include the Armenian case in the list of genocide in 1974. This is not the reaction of some young Armenians. This is, for part, the decision of the main political party of the Armenian diaspora. The fact that the Justice Commandos were created by the Dashnik Party itself was demonstrated by Gates Minassian, who is a French Armenian scholar in his doctoral thesis, and nobody made the slightest rebuttal of his findings based on the proper archive of the Dashnik Party. This new wave of terrorism is not a parenthesis. The actual parenthesis in the history of Armenian terrorism is the 1945-1972 period. Indeed, from its creation in 1890 to the end of the Ottoman time, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation practiced terrorism widely, both against Turks and against loyalist Armenians. For instance, the main founder, the main creator of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Christopher Mikhailian, was killed by his proper bomb, preparing an assassination attempt against the Sultan Abdulhamid II in 1905. Vedlos Kapamagian, mayor, was elected mayor of Van thanks to the massive support of Turkish and Kurdish constituents, and he was killed by Dashnik terrorists in 1912. He was a great supporter of the Young Turks, in spite of he was an Armenian. Similarly, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation organized a new terrorist network in 1919-1920 named Nemesis to kill Turkish and Azerbaijani leaders, as well, once again, as loyalist Armenians. Not less than 200 people were on the initial list, but the ambitions were eventually reduced to some people. From 1926 to 1937, the Dashnik Party's attempt to impose by force its hegemony on the Armenian diaspora led to several assassinations. Anti-Dashnik Armenians killed or tried to kill some Dashnik leaders in revolt. The bloody clashes were interrupted only by World War II when the Dashnik Party took the side of the Axis, namely Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. It is clear that the decision of 1972 was by no means something new for the Armenian but rather the return to a strong tradition. However, the return of the Armenian Jews is not understandable out of the context of the Cold War. After having been pro-Nazist for years, briefly pro-Stalinist in 1945, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation became pro-American around 1948 and reversed it again instead after 1965. The pro-Soviet stance became official during the Congress of 1972, the very same Congress which decided the creation of a new terrorist group. Turkey was indeed a key member of NATO since 1952. Its importance was obvious during the crisis of the missile in Cuba. During the 1960s, the Soviet Union increased its ties with the Armenian diaspora, and it was a part of a more general shift to destabilize Turkey by Israel. After seeing the origin, let's see the scope. From 1973 to 1987, more than 70 people were killed by Armenian terrorists, including 30 Turkish diplomats, guards, or members of their family. More than 500 people were wounded. Contrary to a legend, the majority of the Turkish diplomats were not killed by the Armenian Secret Army for Liberation of Armenia, but by the Dashnak terrorists. Contrary to the another legend, it was not the Asala, but the Justice Commandos, which started the bombing in public places. The first one took place on May 29, 1977. 2 bombs of Dashnak terrorists killed 6 Turks in Istanbul, 5 in Yeshikol Airport, 1 in Sergici, Twin State. 64 were wounded. The racist dimension of the Armenian terrorism is especially obvious in considering the bombing of Turkish cultural activities, for instance in Beverly Hills in April 1976 and in Los Angeles on June 3, 1981. Terrorism was also used as a way of intimidation against historians who did not accept the Armenian nationalist narrative. Stanford Shaw, professor at University of California, Los Angeles, Isabel Shaw, his wife, and their daughter, at that time 14 years old, were victims of an attempt of assassination by Asala, by bomb, in October 1977. In 1982, Stanford Shaw's office in the university was ransacked by Armenian students, and he had to leave to Istanbul for 6 months, because there was a new attempt to kill him. And it was by no means an isolated case. The Cold War dimension of the Armenian terrorism is especially clear in considering the assassination by the Justice Commandos, by the Dashnak terrorists, of the Turkish military attaché in Canada in 1982, and of the Turkish ambassador in Belgrade, Galip Baykar, also a Dashnak terrorist, because Baykar was one of the most promising Turkish diplomats at the time. It was a direct attack against a key NATO state. Similarly, it is striking that the administrative attaché of the Turkish embassy in Bulgaria was murdered by Justice Commandos on September 9, 1982, and that the perpetrators were never arrested, like the streets of Galip Baykar. Communist Bulgaria was indeed a totalitarian country with an omnipresent political police. You cannot kill somebody in Bulgaria in 1982 without the agreement of the political police. However, Armenian terrorism was not only an extremely violent attack against Turks and against anybody who was assimilated to the Turkish side by Armenian terrorists, but also the expression of a deep hatred against actually most of the non-Armenian people, a kind of bitterness against the universe. Robert Denekian, who killed 2 Turkish diplomats in 1973, himself was very clear during his trial. The double murder he committed was also a protest about what he considered as the insensitivity of the world. Then, Armenian terrorists felt free to kill numerous non-Turkish unarmed civilians, 2 Italians in Milan, 1980, 1 Swiss who was 15 years old in Geneva in 1981, 1 American in addition to 8 Turks in Ankara Airport in August 1982, 1 French secretary in Paris, February 1983, 4 French, 1 Sweden, and 1 American in Orly, in addition to 2 Turks in Orly Airport, in July 1982. All these bombings were perpetrated by Assad, but in October 1982, the FBI arrested 5 Justice Commandos terrorists who wanted to destroy the building where the Turkish consulate of Philadelphia was located. According to the FBI estimation endorsed by the US Federal Appeal Court, the bomb would have killed at least 100 people, or in daytime between 2,000 and 3,000. The leader of this Al-Qaeda-style group, Beacon of Sapien, let's guess who we know, who is now a member of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation World Bureau and the chief of this party in the United States. In addition, in November 1986, another attempt of bombing by the Justice Commandos failed in Melbourne because of an error committed by the perpetrator. Only this criminal was killed, but according to the police, many people, mostly Australian, would have been killed if the plot had been successful. This terrorism was not the fact of few people only. From the beginning, the Armenian Jews received a massive support in the diaspora. As early as March 1973, a support committee was created, raising $50,000 for Yannickian's defense, mostly from small donations, which means that there were thousands of donations. Remarkably, some of the leaders of the support committee for Yannickian were also responsible for the construction of the first monument commemorating what they called the Armenian genocide in Montebello, California. Buses full of children from 7 years old to 13 years old were sent by Armenian Association of Los Angeles to Santa Barbara, where the Yannickian trial took place, to show to these children, this is a hero. Yannickian was sentenced to life-term imprisonment in July 1923, and the appeal court confirmed the verdict in May 1974. But Governor George McMahon ordered to release him for health reasons in January 1984, and he died 2 weeks later. During this decade, 1993-1984, Goran Yannickian received gifts and letters of congratulations. Hundreds of Armenian Americans attended his funerals, and some of them kissed his hands. The Armenian Reporter, one of the main Armenian American newspapers, independent of any political organization, and definitely not the most selected one, published regardless an apologetic necrology of Yannickian, saying that he opened a new era of political struggle and changed the course of Armenian history. For the Dashnak terrorists, it was the things were even clearer. The legal wings of the Dashnak party all over the world unconditionally supported the terrorist wing. Official statements of the Justice Commandos were published in Dashnak newspapers, for instance, the Armenian Weekly in Boston or ISLAN in Paris. Inflammatory editorials were published to support and glorify Armenian terrorism, more exactly Dashnak terrorism. It is especially significant that one of the authors of such articles, which actually were barely more than calls for murder, Murat Hamdanazian, is now co-chairman of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation for Western Europe, and also co-chairman of the Coordination Council of French-Armenian Associations. When the Dashnak terrorist was arrested, he received full support, financial and verbal. For instance, $250,000 was raised for Ambik Sassounian's first legal costs. Mr. Sassounian had been sentenced to life for the murder of the Turkish General Consulate of Los Angeles. He is still in jail. He is a single one. Crowds of Dashnaks attended the trials, Sassounian trials of course, a Kilian trial in Aix-en-Provence, France, in 1980. Beyond the place of the trials, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation organized support committees all over the world, especially for Ambik Sassounian. Such committees were established in various countries of Europe and the Middle East. For Ansara, it was the reverse. This terrorist group created political wings, mostly in France, United Kingdom, and United States. The political wing in France was led by Jean-Marc Aka Doranian, who is now the other co-chairman of the Coordination Council of France's Armenian Association. In addition, a comité de soutien aux prisonniers politiques arméniens, support committee for Armenian political prisoners, was created in 1980 to support financially both Assalam and Justice Commandos terrorists arrested in France, Switzerland, and Netherlands. The climax of the support for terrorism took place in the United States at the beginning of 1984 for the Stassunian trial. It took place also in France at the beginning of 1984 during the trial of 4 Assalam terrorists who had attacked the Turkish General Consulate of Paris. In September 1981, and the trial took place also in the beginning of 1984. In spite of the Dashnak Assalam relations, the French Dashnak fully supported the Assalam terrorists. Charles Dabour and other French Armenian artists sent letters of support for the terrorists. So, it is not only the decision of few people or a political party. It does not mean, of course, that the whole Armenian diaspora was involved in the support to terrorists, but a significant fraction was. Indeed, Armenian terrorism and propaganda know toward each other. First, it has a coherent strategy of communication, with some success and some failures. Places of attacks were chosen carefully to produce the maximal effect in the institutional media. Paris, 1975, 1979, 1981, 1983, recall. Vienna, 1975, 1984, Rome, 1977, 1980, New York, 1980, and Brussels, 1983, are all known communications, place of intellectual media. However, the trials of the terrorists were fully integrated in the strategy of communication. Wolfgang Yenekian, inspired by Slobodan Teverian, another Dashnak terrorist in 1921, wanted to transform his trial into, I quote, the trial of 1950. He failed largely since the prosecutor refused the discussion about the events of World War I and focused on the actual case, a double murder motivated by vested. The appeal court confirmed the judgment in 1974. It did not prevent most of the indignant Armenian terrorists, their lawyers and their supporters to use the genocide allegation as an argument, mostly in the 1980s. Yenekian's failures, however, gave a false impression to the Turkish side, and that's probably why no argument was provided during the trials of Mardi Rosem